MESA is a nonprofit organization, the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance, and we are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who are passionate about protecting the environment, and we work to protect our climate, our air, our water, our natural lands. We believe that our doctrine encourages us to do that and really requires us to be good stewards of the earth. And so that's what we are about, is working individually and as a group and hopefully as a church to protect this beautiful earth that has been created for our benefit. And we want to encourage other church members and church leaders and the church organization to do that. So that is what we're going to do tonight, is hear some members of the church talk about what our role is as members of the church, specifically with the Paris Climate Accord, which was signed on this day 5 years ago in Paris, with most countries in the world signing that agreement. And the agreement was intended to limit climate or global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, or preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times. That's a big challenge, but really important to prevent really serious environmental and human suffering. So we're excited tonight to hear, well, let me first also mention that the people who've done a lot of work in preparing this event are Soren Simonson, one of our board members and founding member of MESA, and Sylvia Wilcox, staff member of MESA. We appreciate and recognize their work on this. So first of all, we'll hear from David Reiser. Let me tell you just a little bit about David, and he can tell you a little bit more. David is a husband and father of 3 living in Sandy, Utah. He has spent extended time around the world in the Utah National Guard and on a church mission. He has degrees in physics, bioengineering, and medicine, specializing in physical medicine and rehabilitation. He worked for Intermountain Healthcare for 29 years as their medical director of neurologic rehabilitation at LDS Hospital and Intermountain Medical Center. And currently he's a volunteer for the Citizens Climate Lobby, specifically the LDS Action Team that is within that Citizens Climate Lobby, and he'll tell you more about that. So we're excited to have David here tonight. David, go ahead.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed MESA's seminar on climate in September, and I appreciate you sponsoring this event, because this is a cause that is important to me. Ever since I retired a couple of years ago, I have volunteered for the Citizens Climate Lobby, which was introduced by a sister of a sister-in-law. And it was an excellent fit for me. Their values, which are respect and gratitude and a nonpartisan approach with appreciation for all sides on this issue, was a good fit for me. And I found a lot of good people, and I appreciate that. And I had a particular interest in the intersection between climate and faith, and therefore joined with the LDS Action Team, which is one of a dozen faith groups within Citizens Climate Lobby. Just by way of introduction to Citizen Climate Lobby, there's several 100,000 of us around the world and over 600 chapters. And I belong to the Salt Lake chapter. We are laser focused on the mission of creating the political will to address climate change. So we don't have the broad involvement that MESA has in the environmental scope. We're very much about climate change and addressing that. And we have a favorite solution. It's called carbon fee and dividend, and more specifically HR 763, which is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is before Congress, has been for a year, and this next year will be a telling year in regards to passing climate legislation. And that's what we're about. It's effective, it's good for our health, for jobs, for the economy. It has bipartisan support and support by most economists. If you want to learn more about it, MESA has a link in the invite that'll take you to our website called CCL Community, and there you find a whole variety of things. I'd recommend to you a particular video called The Far Middle. It's very enjoyable. It was put together by Nick Huey, who was a BYU graduate recently, and it's enjoyable, and I think you'd learn something. So with that, let me dive into the two questions we were asked to address. The first is about the Paris Climate Agreement, and I'll address this by sharing some snippets from my life, which were informative with respect to the agreement. You know, after I served a mission in Europe, I signed up to be a counselor with a well-established international boys camp in upstate New York. And there we had 60 boys ages 13 to 16 who came from 8 different states and 20 different countries, from Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and South America. And I was the designated outdoor counselor. And so I got to take these diverse groups on trips such as canoeing in the Adirondack State Park or camping in the Catskill Mountains. It was a wonderful experience. And there I learned something about the energy and the promise of youth, and about how universal the love for the outdoors and for God's creations is, and how that brings us together. And I think that's pertinent to the climate agreement. The second experience was after working for Intermountain for about a decade, they were granted the contract to provide medical services to the 2002 Olympics and Paralympics. And as a medical director for rehabilitation, I thought I had a good shot at helping them out. And I volunteered and was accepted to be their scout for medical services for the Paralympics, going to Nagano, Japan, and then Sydney, Australia, and a number of other events. And there I found out about how a large, wealthy international event is run. I saw a lot of the scientific infrastructure, which is part of the medical services. I learned a lot about the altruism which goes into such an organization, as well as some other mixed motives, unfortunately, as there was politics very much involved. And I think you agree, this is very much similar to what the challenges they had for addressing climate change on an international basis. It is a big, complex organization. The third experience was that a colleague who went with me to Japan was also a return missionary from Haiti. And soon after he started working with us, he recruited dozens of our staff to go on medical missions to Haiti. He's been there dozens and dozens of times to provide medical rehabilitation services to this country in the Caribbean, which clearly is both poor and vulnerable. This is a result of both man and nature, and not a consequence of anything they have control over. In fact, a few years ago, Columbia University designated through a study that Haiti is the most vulnerable country in the world with respect to the devastating effects predicted, happening now from climate change and predicted. And I think you agree that part of the challenge is that we have with climate change is how it affects differentially those who are poor and vulnerable, and less so the well-to-do. I was in Haiti on 4 different occasions, both before and after the devastating earthquake in 2010. Climate change, no doubt, will be more devastating. It is a train wreck in slow motion, which will kill more than the hundreds of thousands that the earthquake killed, and have greater effects on that population there and around the world. Those are kind of personal snippets that I think summarize some of my thoughts about the energy and promise of youth, the importance of protecting the poor and the vulnerable, and the need for international cooperation on a grand scale for the complex organization of addressing climate change, which I think is obviously clearly needed and timely. The next question was about addressing climate change at all levels of society. And I'll take kind of a personal approach to that too. First level, I think for all of us is our families. And my kids are all grown, and they're, as young adults, they accept the importance of this. It's so important to their futures. But my extended family includes a variety of folks who have been very active in conservative politics in Idaho, California, Utah. In fact, one of them has written a book about how windmills can cause cancer, and how the wildfires, which almost burned down her home a couple of times, may have been started by a government conspiracy. Those are some of the challenges ahead of us. Harping on the science isn't going to convince such folks who are good people, easy to love them dearly, but it's going to take some other persuasion and concern to help them out. On the ward and the neighborhood level, it's kind of like a large, complex family sometimes. I think you agree, and I think it's important to avoid political discussions in our ward houses, but still, if presented correctly, this isn't a political issue. It's about God's creations and our responsibility to have stewardship over them. And I found opportunities such as when I was asked to give a sacrament talk around the 4th of July, soon after I came back from a trip to Washington, D.C. to lobby for addressing climate change. And it was a very natural thing for me to talk about the adventures in Washington, D.C., about our government, about the blessings of our government and some of the challenges ahead of us. And other times in testimony meeting, I really care about God's creations, and I have no problem with sharing those beliefs and those feelings with my ward members. One of the consequences I found is that a friend in my ward, Craig Smith, found out about my interests, and he is a banker who's just retiring, and he asked me, "Hey, can I volunteer?" And I said, "Sure." And we've been good friends since, and gone to a lot of events together and done some work together. And that's one of the consequences that can happen with with sharing what we know and what we experience openly with our friends and neighbors. On a community level, we most of us belong to a city or a council that has civic responsibilities. I belong to Sandy City, and a half dozen of us from Citizens Climate Lobby have been to that council and have lobbied for things like 100% clean energy. And we came very close to getting it passed, but not quite, but we've passed other things, and we have good support there. On the state level, it's even more important to link up with an organization to make a difference there. My organization of choice was the State Medical Society, who invites us up by the hundreds to meet with the legislature in February each year. And there I've met with my state representative and senator multiple times and found they're very supportive. Of course, they're all Republican and they have skeptic constituents, but they appreciate our input, and great things are happening. And I'll be happy to share some of those thoughts later. On a national level, Citizens Climate Lobby, twice a year, we lobby with roughly 500 of our legislators, senators, and congressional offices. And I've been lucky to be there 3 times in person, twice online, and met with 7 congressmen or senators. 6 out of the 7 were LDS in 4 different states. Always had a positive response, although one's a little bit indifferent, I must say. But in any case, we're making progress, and that's how we roll in Citizens Climate Lobby. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some of that with you. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Appreciate your personal messages and the information. And if people want to go to Citizens Climate Lobby, there's a link, as he mentioned, in the email that you received from us inviting you to this meeting. So our next speaker, Dan Burgoyne. Dan is a sustainability manager for California's Department of General Services. He's a California licensed architect and LEED fellow. He's been working for 19 years in developing and leading the implementation of California policies and executive orders in energy, green building, zero net energy, and climate change adaptation and resiliency for state facilities. So he's been busy. Dan lives in Folsom, California, where he and his wife raised 3 children. Dan, we appreciate you being here. And just as a reminder, folks, if you want to ask questions, you can do that in the Q&A box. You can type those in anytime during this event, and then we'll ask them to the panelists at the end of the meeting. Go ahead, Dan.
Happy to be with you. Thank you. Yeah, like David, I also served a mission in Europe, in Switzerland, and I was very impressed back in the early 80s of just how the people there just took care of everything. And, they had lived there for a few centuries longer than us, and were very conservation minded, took very good care of their forests, their resources, and I was just so impressed. The Paris Climate Agreement, as a state, we joined the Paris Climate Agreement, state of California, and California's gross national product, if it were a country, would put us at about the 6th largest, and that has continued. So regardless of the U.S. withdrawing a few years ago, I'm happy that it looks like we'll likely rejoin the climate agreement. It was such a huge accomplishment to see 97% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions represented in countries that all agreed that we need to do something about this. We need to reduce this to slow down the global warming, the greenhouse gas levels. Just in my lifetime, the average global temperature has risen about 1 degree Fahrenheit, and it's on a rapid rise. I'm sure you've seen the charts, and it does not look like it's slowing down anytime soon. So as a state, we've made some huge commitments, and I've been able to participate in some of that to reducing climate reductions and reducing carbon in different sectors. One of those sectors, a big sector, if you look at what produces the carbon, is energy generation and energy use. And California has made the commitment that by 2030, in just 10 years, that 60% of our electrical grid will be from renewable energy, and 100% by 2045, 15 years later. And the state is making huge progress in that. I believe we're over 30% already, working at energy storage solutions. That helps. In the transportation sector, we have introduced low emission standards for vehicles many years ago to curb air pollution, and now, in fact, have an executive order recently issued that would require all vehicles purchased in California to be zero emissions starting 2035. So that's 15 years out, but and it's a very high target, but the state already has a lot of electric vehicles underway, and the infrastructure to charge these and keep these going is improving every day. On efficiency, it's been my focus a lot, is looking to make our buildings much more efficient. And in fact, our energy codes are among the strictest in the country. We're finding that energy efficiency is cost effective. A lot of my efforts have gone into state buildings and regulations to take state buildings to, we actually have a mandate that every state building that is built as of 3 years ago is or will be a zero net energy building upon completion. That means that it generates and gets as much renewable energy to offset 100% of its energy use over the course of a year. And we're actually finding, I was on a call with a bunch of other states this week, and the question came up, well, how much more does that cost us? Well, we're finding that it doesn't have to cost us anything. In fact, the strategies that we're using, including long-term renewable energy through power purchase agreements, through community solar programs, is actually saving us millions of dollars. We're saving money going to zero net energy. So, you know, that's been really exciting. The second part of the question, how can we as members, as people, you know, members of the church, members of communities, the state, nations, what can we do to help address climate change? And one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite general authorities, Dieter F. Uchtdorf, says, "Lift where you're standing." And we've heard some mention of that. You know, start where you're at. Start in your own family, in your own community. Kids get this; they understand it. As many of us have seen, it's common sense to them. Why wouldn't you want to take care of things and conserve and to not pollute, reduce waste? There are simple things we can do that are now we know are cost effective. You know, replacing is something as simple as changing out your light bulbs to LEDs, recycling, other ways to conserve. We can check with utilities. How can a lot of the utilities have programs where they'll actually give us money back for conserving? We can. California has a lot of different programs to support that. Support and participate in community programs and in local government. You know, these are important issues, and our voices need to be heard. And I think a lot of people agree. In a lot of there are a lot of members in the Utah and Idaho area, and beautiful part of the world. And I don't think anyone wants to see things go to waste or deteriorate. Additionally, I know that, secondly, I wanted to just, Elder Stephen E. Snow said, adopt lifestyles and personal habits that respect the creation. You know, that's really important too. There are a lot of references in the scriptures from the creation of the world all the way through, and the church has some great resources on conservation with wonderful references. It is our responsibility to take care of God's creations, and we need to preserve this for future generations. I'm really thankful for my opportunity to, you know, I started my career as an architect. I'm still an architect, but my focus has been more on policy and how can I affect the whole state building program. So it's been a great experience, a great ride. I'm happy to be able to speak with you tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that very much. Again, a reminder, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. So our final speaker will be Emily Osler. Emily has a Bachelor's of Arts in International Relations, and she's studied or worked in Tanzania, India, Myanmar, and China, where her interactions with others caused her to consider the roles religion plays in global development and environmental sustainability. She's now pursuing a Master's of Theological Studies at Harvard Divinity School, where she studies the intersections between spirituality, the environment, and societal well-being. Emily, we're glad to have you here. Go ahead. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. This is really fun for me to be a part of. I am super happy that this group exists and that people are here having these conversations. I am vastly less experience than both Dan and David, so hopefully I have something to offer. I'm going to be sharing just a little bit about my experiences and sort of what drove me to become more involved with sustainability issues. And then I'm going to take a little bit more of a theological approach of why LDS people should care. And I also wrote down more things, so it might sound a little bit less conversational than the other speakers, but we'll go with that. So the first time that I really became aware of these issues was when I was doing research in India a few years ago. I was doing research on development policy. It was nothing related to climate, but I was just overwhelmed by the amount of pollution. I'd walk to work every day and it would be hot and humid and it would smell like decaying waste, and people would be laying in the trash and people would be drinking out of dirty water. And I realized like the air was filled with smog. And it hit me that these people were not the drivers of the pollution in their country. It was people in America and in the West who were purchasing things that was driving pollution in those countries. And I realized in Utah, my life is so minimally impacted by climate change, because if I have trash, it's just taken away, so I don't see it. There's a little bit of smog in the winter, but most things aren't really just like produced in the valley. And I can just turn on my AC, I can just do whatever I want. So I'm just very buffered from the environment. And so it disproportionately affects the poor, and it's disproportionately caused by the wealthy. And when I started to realize that, I started to study more, and I realized how people's water sources were poisoned by dyes, or how crops around the world were affected by my emissions. And it caused me to consider how care for the environment is connected to my responsibility to care for my neighbor that I have within an LDS framework. And so throughout Jesus's ministry, he basically kept telling us to expand our notion of neighbor. People are like, who's my neighbor? And he always pointed to people that people didn't really consider their neighbor. And I think once we continue to expand our notion of neighbor, it's impossible to not care for the environment, because we realize that our human family around the globe, and I would argue even other species, animals, plants, who are also our neighbors, are very impacted by our actions. And to me, this is what the Paris and Climate Agreement embodies, because there are some short-term sacrifices that need to be made, or transitions to greater energy. But to me, it shows how countries came together and said, hey, we're going to care for each other, and we're also going to care for future generations. And I think that's a really important thing to do. So once I started to realize these connections, I started to get a little bit more specifically involved. When I was at Brigham Young University, I got involved with BYU SA, which is the Brigham Young University Student Association or something. I actually don't know what the acronym stands for, which is really embarrassing, but I was on the sustainability team. So I was trying to get some sustainability offices and things like that established at BYU, and then the pandemic happened, so it kind of just took a really big backseat. And I also made some other changes in my life, just personal things, learning about how I can better treat the environment and give back to the environment, which gives so much to me. And sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. So, and then as I continued to study all of these issues and study more and more, I started to realize just more and more layers of how these are interconnected, because I became happier when I spent more time outside. I realized that became a very spiritual place for me. So it wasn't even just physical needs, it was spiritual needs that were being met by the environment, and that's something I want for other people. And so going back to the Paris Climate Agreement, I was very happy that it existed, and I was very sad when the US left, but I felt like there was a silver lining, and that was the We're Still In movement that sparked after that. So a ton of businesses and states and tribes all came together after we left, and they said, hey, we're still in, we still care. And I want to read a part of their statement that they made. It said, in the absence of leadership from Washington, we, representing a sizable percentage of the US economy, will pursue ambitious climate goals, working together to take forceful action and to ensure that the US remains a global leader in reducing emissions. Together, we will remain actively engaged with the international community as part of the global effort to hold warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy that will benefit our security, prosperity, and health. This also reminded me of a scripture, which is probably very obvious to all of you, DNC 58:27. So in this statement, they said they were going to remain actively engaged in transitioning the economy to greener solutions. And it reminded me of DNC 58:27, which says that we must be anxiously engaged in a good cause. So while like the US as a whole might not be anxiously engaged in this cause, it's sort of a divisive issue still. I was really excited that so many people said, hey, they were proactive and they decided to be involved in this issue. It affects our human family across the world. And so I'm going to the second question now. I want to talk about a few things that we can all do to be engaged in this cause from a personal level and a community level. So the first thing is kind of what other people were touching on, is getting involved with community organizations, your ward, whatever you can to kind of bring other people who might not be just head over heels about this issue. How can we bridge those gaps? How can we bring other people in? Because my guess is that most people here, maybe not everybody, but probably most have some sort of care for the environment. And so how do we find the people who just aren't a part of these discussions? When I was a part of BYUSA, that was kind of the issue, is it was not a priority for BYU, for the students or the administration. And so I wondered how you could get people to care. And there's a woman named Lori Patton. She's the president of Middlebury University, or Middlebury College in Vermont, and they are a carbon neutral university. They're awesome. And she came and visited BYU. And so I met with her and I said, hey, do you have any advice on how I can kind of push this here? It's just not a part of our culture here. And she said, you need to understand their language and you need to understand where they're coming from and you need to meet them where they're at. And so I've just been contemplating that and how I can use less divisive language, less harsh language, and less complex language. Because some people just don't like all the numbers. Some people love all the numbers. Some people love the theology and some people like the emotional things. So meeting people where they're at will help people want to be involved with the issues. And then the second thing is, this one's kind of niche, but whether in your own, so this is just a personal practice you can do, whether in your own home or anywhere else that you have jurisdiction over landscaping, is to incorporate more native species. This is something I'm just very excited about. At Harvard, I'm part of the Council for Student Sustainability Leaders, and we're working on a micro prairie project where we try to incorporate more native species into Harvard's campus. And this reduces the need for extra fertilizers, and it reduces water needs, it reduces needs for other resources and energy, and the plants are just more self-sustaining. It also impacts pollinator species, and it helps bug populations, which helps birds populations. Like, it all comes from just adding more native plants into your yard. There's all these spin-off effects. So that's something I've been very excited about, and it's fun to learn about your own ecosystem. So you might do that with your own gardens. And then the last thing is to just be an example to others. Just, like at board activities, offer to separate trash and recycling, or I went to LDS or Stewardships, or I listened to their panel the other week, and there was a woman who was in charge of sustainability issues. I think her calling was related to stewardship in her ward. And I thought that was really cool. And perhaps you could suggest something like that, or suggest to take upon those roles yourself. Or you could suggest ward activities that get people outside and connected with the environment, or picking up trash even. These are just a few suggestions, but there's lots of things you can do to care for the planet. And just try a few of these things. And I think it's kind of, you have to figure out what works for you and your situations, but also stretch yourself. And it's going to be uncomfortable. It's not easy to buy less things. It's not easy to reuse things. It's not easy to kind of have some more difficult conversations about this. But to me, it's environmental stewardship is deeply connected to the well-being of our human family. And so if we want to care for our neighbor, we do have to care for the earth. And so I thank you all for being here tonight, because that shows that you care.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was beautiful. I thought about that too, caring for our neighbor. Who is our neighbor, and what responsibility do we have? We're all neighbors on this planet Earth, Turtle Island, as some Native Americans refer to it. And we shouldn't spoil the earth for others. I just wanted to highlight a few things that each of our panelists have said and then ask some questions. David, I'm impressed by the work you're doing with the Citizens Climate Lobby, and I encourage folks to look at their webpage and find out what they're doing and how you might get engaged with that effort locally or nationally to reduce the impacts of climate change. I appreciated him talking about countries that are vulnerable, like Haiti. Those are the countries that are going to really suffer the most. And Emily talked about that in India as well. And we need to be more thoughtful about how the poor and the vulnerable are going to suffer because of the things that we're doing, that the first world nations and people are doing as we consume and burn carbon. Dan, I appreciated you talking about how government and institutions can really be a tool in reducing the impacts of climate change. We can't do it alone as individuals. We have to work as institutions and as structures, and you're leading in that, and we appreciate that. And government is a tool, and it says in D&C that government was instituted for the benefit of man. And so we need to use that tool as God has ordained it. And Emily, I loved you talked about the things I mentioned before, pollution and caring for each other, but also native plants. That's a passion of mine. I have a degree in vegetation ecology, and so I have a passion for native plants as well. So thanks for encouraging us to use native plants in our landscaping. And we also need to conserve the natural areas that exist already. So I want to start off with a question. We have one question in the Q&A box, and if others have questions, please type them in and we'll address as many as we can. And panelists, if you have questions for each other, you can also think about those. I want to ask the question to our panelists, any or all of them: what could the church do as an institution to help reduce the impacts of climate change?
I think one easy answer is teaching us correct principles and govern ourselves. It really is a principle of stewardship, of honoring the creation to honor the creator. And I think one of our goals in our action team is to normalize the discussion of earth stewardship.
Mm-hmm.
It feels a little uneasy to do so now, but I think there are many good people that throughout the church who are very interested in this topic. They just have been taught, at least for the past 30 or 40 years. It wasn't so much when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, but lately that it's a political topic, and there's a lot of history behind that. But normalizing the discussion and the concern about the earth and its creations is I think, fundamental to making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the church is already doing a lot in regard to this. It's just not as visible as some of, as if you do research, if you do a search on the church websites, you'll find tons of information on the conservation efforts and that the church is involved in. Many talks have referenced how important this is. One of my stake calling, I have responsibility over facilities in our stake, and I know working with the church facilities, they are very interested in conservation and sustainability as it relates to keeping the grounds beautiful, keeping things efficient and operating, keeping everything just beautiful. And anyone who walks on any of our temple grounds sees that.
Yeah, I think some of us are aware of those efforts the church is doing to build some buildings that are more efficient and like the landscaping at the new conference center is a lot of native species and they use recycled water there. But I think a lot of people aren't aware of those things. So maybe we as members and the church as an institution should highlight those more and use those as an example of what other institutions and individuals can do.
Two words you won't hear often in any church context is climate change.
Yeah.
We're careful to avoid that. We have general authorities that have uttered those terms, or global warming, and that's on the church website. But it's not very common, and most people don't think it's a thing. A place where you can find plenty of reporting and solid information about it is in the church-owned newspaper, the Deseret News. Some people may be surprised by this, but it is a robust source of reliable information about climate change. And I'm part of a group that has documented this. In 2 years, it went from about 8 articles a month to a high of 80 articles a month, specifically about climate change or related issues. And 100% of those written by the staff of the Deseret News were consistent with the National Climate Assessment, which we consider a gold standard for climate-related science. So that's a bright spot. Whether that's the church speaking or not, that's a different thing, but it's certainly supported in that sense by the church.
That's a good point. And maybe one thing we could do to sort of enhance that is to write letters to the editor and cite some of those articles that the Deseret News or other newspapers are writing about the importance of understanding and addressing climate change. And newspapers are more likely to print letters if they reference a previously published article in that newspaper, because it's a nice little feedback advertising kind of thing for them. So thanks, David.
I think that, I think a lot of people are starting to recognize and believe that things are warming up. And we've had 19 of the last 20 years have been the hottest on record. Since 1900, or since, I'm sorry, 2000, 19 of those have been of the top 20 temperatures. I think what people just don't understand or may not accept is what is causing this.
Yeah. So David or Daniel, you deal with encouraging and motivating institutions to use efficient vehicles. Could the church do something along that line? Use low emissions or zero emissions vehicles?
I would think as long as the infrastructure is in place, and I think the whole country is going to go that direction eventually, but it all starts somewhere. It's very cost efficient, and we're seeing the price points on these zero emission vehicles come down considerably. Performance is great. I'm sure a number of the people listening probably may even own some of these vehicles, but yeah, the infrastructure is the challenge. I don't see why, I think the church is supportive of conserving the resources. I don't see why they wouldn't be supportive of that. I don't know what they do on their own on their own fleets. I know that the church is looking at energy conserving buildings. That is a priority in church facilities. So I've heard and so I've seen. Yeah.
Thanks. Emily, a question for you. You're in the younger generation in our panel. Do you feel like your generation is actively engaged in trying to address climate change, or do you think there's some people who have given up and feel like it's kind of a lost cause? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think you get as many people that just think it's a lost cause. I think there is a lot of that hopelessness, but I think those people are generally pretty driven to do what they can. It sort of, unfortunately, is very politicized, as other people were hinting at. So there's just a lot of division. People saying, hey, this is not something I care about. It's sort of either about business or the environment, and there's not a lot of room for those two places to have dialogue. So I think, but you do need hope. I was getting really hopeless about it because you read the statistics and it's super devastating. And there was a book that I actually didn't read, but I read the title, and the title was really good. And it was called Active Hope, and it was about the environment, and which made me very happy because it wasn't just like a complacent hope, like, oh, it's just gonna be better one day. It was like a hope that was grounded on like your engagement, and a hope that was like embodied in your engagement. And so that's something I have personally tried to do, and I've seen other friends do. And I think that's the only way that, you know, these things are going to get better. And with that, we need to celebrate successes. I think it's really easy to kind of just keep looking at like, oh, darn, we do so many things with our plastic that's so bad, or we do this that's bad. But I think talking about these essays, yeah, that the church has put up, that's really awesome. And like talking about the native species on the conference center, that's really awesome. And I think that will give people, like the people that do those things, that made those articles, that put those plants there, and then other people also motivation to keep doing more. So that was a very vague answer, but there is a little bit of lack of hope. And I think celebrating successes and showing like hope is how we move forward. Well
said. Thank you. Let me ask a question from one of our audience members. Somebody asked about the what David was talking about, but anybody can answer this question. She says, I understand that carbon fee and dividend incentivizes businesses to lower their carbon footprint. Can you explain the actual process by which carbon dividends benefit the average consumer?
I'd be happy to address that. When economists talk about market failures, one of the ways they fail is by not considering the externalities. And the most common one is pollution. If companies can freely throw their pollution into the air or into the next yard and so forth without any consequences, the market's not going to correct that, and we have a problem. If there is a cost for polluting, the market becomes more in alignment with reality, with what is fair, and those who are and externalities are part of the decision-making process so that the free markets can work. Putting a price on carbon is what economists say is what's necessary. It's fundamental to the many other things which need to happen, is so markets can function as they're designed to. And the most common way to do it is to put a fee on oil and gas at the wellhead, or to coal, other fossil fuels at the mine. That will, of course, be passed on for the most part to the consumer, and prices will raise. And that's where the second part comes in, and that is the dividend. If things cost more, the oil costs more, the coal costs more, prices will go up. but someone who receives that extra cost of the oil and the coal and so forth in a carbon fee and dividend plan that's revenue neutral, that increased revenue is turned back on an even basis to the consumers throughout the country. And that's what the carbon fee and dividend is about. It's fair, it works. We have great data on it. For 40% of the world, in fact, has some form of carbon fee in place right now. In fact, the US and India are the only two of the 10 largest economies that don't have some sort of carbon fee in place. And the third component, which is important besides the fee and the dividend, is a border adjustment, because you can imagine if we charge our businesses extra money, their costs go up, and people may turn to other countries to get their commodities. You might have seen that Europe just put a border adjustment on their goods, so that if we buy from them and we don't have a carbon fee in place, we're paying more for them. And as stated, Canada has a carbon fee and dividend in place countrywide now. So when those come into place, America will be at a disadvantage if we don't put a fee on carbon. Anyway, and it's also a way that we can incentivize other countries to put a fee on carbon, China, India, and so forth. That's how we influence the world, besides just being a good example. The economy is a strong force. And the other thing, of course, it does is it incentivizes everything else we want to happen. Innovation will happen more quickly if carbon neutral or carbon free sources of energy become cheaper, and carbon rich sources relatively are more expensive. So it's what we call a free market, a market driven way to solve this dilemma. It's not the only thing that needs to be done, but it's a foundation for it that the majority of economists, in fact, the biggest statement by economists that we've ever seen was in the Wall Street Journal, 3,500 economists, all the Nobel Prize winners, 35 of them at least, and other notable economists and finance people said carbon fee is what's necessary and the most efficient way to address this problem. So that's why it's the centerpiece of what we try to lobby for.
Yeah, we do address it as a state, and the state polluters do have to pay a fee, and they have to buy carbon credits. There's a big auction that happens every year or so in California where they auction off carbon credits. So if a manufacturer is causing a lot of emissions that exceed a certain threshold, then they have to buy these credits. And so it motivates them to make changes to be less polluting. And then those carbon credits get spent on programs that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state.
Glad to hear. Thanks for that. One of our attendees, I'll just mention, we had 27 or so participants listed at one point. One person wanted to mention that the LDS Earth Stewardship has an event called Creation Conscious Christmas. If you want to find out more about that, you can go to the LDS Earth Stewardship web page. It's called www.eartheast.org. And Soren, you can correct me if I got that wrong. Or Mary Kay, did you want to say anything more about that?
I was just going to say, I lead the regional group for Maryland, DC, Virginia of LDS Earth Stewardship, and we're hosting it, but we'd love anybody, since nowadays we do things on Zoom, anybody who's interested would be welcome to join us. We're just going to share ideas of ways we try to keep our Christmas a joy to the world kind of thing, with an emphasis on caring for the earth.
Great. Thanks for that, Mary Kay.
Mm-hmm.
Panelists, do you have any questions or comments for each other? You don't need to. I just wanted to give you that opportunity. Emily mentioned something about being in nature, nourishing the soul. At least that was my interpretation of what she said. We've talked a little bit about pollution and how terrible that is, especially in developing countries. Let's take a minute and just be a little bit more hopeful and say, how has nature, healthy and clean nature, nourished your soul? Does any panelists want to answer that question?
Well, I think like many, just being outside in nature, helping to cultivate nature through gardening and other means, just really let you recognize that these are God's creations, and it just helps. I don't know how you can be out in nature and not feel closer to God. It's always been very uplifting, and yeah, I think we spend way too much time indoors.
Well, Mark, this is my answer is behind me. This is my what I call my happy place. I can socially distance very well there. It's very close to my home, and I just feel uplifted in going there. It's a little work to get there, but it does a lot for me.
I agree. It's my happy place too. Being in nature and seeing the plants, the rivers, the mountains, the animals. It's just thrilling to me, especially to be high in the mountains and look out over the.
I have a question for Emily. As a young person that's done so much already and been so many places, what are your plans once you've completed at Harvard? Where are you going? What would you like to do next?
That is a very good question, and it changes frequently. But the general consensus has been that I want to work with education policy and fostering care for each other and for the environment in education, just through like building proximity, getting kids outside, learning about local plants, learning about how they can actually, concrete practices that they can take to care for things around them, which sort of, touches on you all seem like you have close. We just were talking about the spiritual relationships with the environment. I think we care for what we love, and there's a just increasing disconnect with, I think, kids as technology is advancing, that we're just becoming so more severed from the environment and from each other, even though we're connected online. I just feel like humans don't have as much interaction. So that's kind of a vague answer, but working with education is the goal.
That's great. A book that I read recently that just really impacted me was called The Nature Fix, and it talks about the benefits that we receive when we spend time in nature, and the benefits are psychological, they're physical, they're spiritual as well. And there's medical evidence that shows the physical benefits, and there's also the psychological benefits, helping us overcome depression and frustration as well. And I know that is the case for me. I'm really uplifted and nourished, and when I spend time in natural places. So there's a lot of impediments to overcoming these challenges of climate change. I think you all touched on them a little bit. Do you have any other thoughts on how we can help to overcome the impediments, especially within a church setting, of people being resistant to addressing climate change? Sometimes people say, oh, God will take care of things in the second coming or something. And I don't agree with that at all. I think we have a responsibility to care for the earth, to be stewards. And I think we're going to be doing it in the millennium if we don't do it now. I think we're all going to be restoration ecologists in the millennium. But do you have any advice, or have you had any success in helping people become more open to addressing climate change?
I've got some hopeful thoughts I'd like to share, and it's kind of a plug for my own congressman, who I've gotten to know fairly well. John Curtis is a conservative Republican in my district, and we have seen him. He's a rising star in the climate, in addressing climate change. He was the mayor of Provo and was very involved with sustainability efforts and personal responsibility. But we know that personal responsibility is very important, but not sufficient to address this issue. And since he's been in Congress, he's evolved in some important ways, and we've enjoyed some great time with him. I hiked to the top of Timpanogos in what he called a walking town hall, along with some others, and so we had a lot of time to talk. I would refer you to his recent talk in August to the Sutherland Institute, a conservative think tank here in Utah, where he talked about climate change is real, and it's we're causing it, and there's a lot we need to do about it. And he gives us and I think it's to a large degree, as conservatives, we need to convince, not that it's a political issue, but that it's been politicized. And he gives us some ideas about how to do that. As a conservative, he says it's not the science that convinces him that we need to address climate change. It's his respect for the creator and for creation. It's his concern for his posterity. It's accountability, it's stewardship, all those things. The science comes into play in determining, shaping how he addresses the problem, not whether he addresses it or not. And that's a conservative approach. And I think I think it appeals to a lot of Latter-day Saints. And so I think it's one thing to listen to. Look at his talk, just Google that, and I think you find some really good ideas.
Yeah, the last 3 or 4 years in California and all along the West Coast this past year, we've seen real strong changes in the climate, and a lot of that's been broadcast through and making the forest fires pretty rampant. And in California we have 5 seasons now. We have the regular forest season and we have fire season, and that season seems to be lengthening every year. This year, usually it's a couple months. We're even seeing some fires flaring up now in different places, but it affects the whole state. And I think that's a combination of both changing climates, making trees and things more vulnerable, as well as some poor forest management practices. It's not all one or all the other, it's a combination. But my efforts right now are mainly focused on climate adaptation. Yes, we have mitigation measures in place, but it's happening, and we've seen it happen. We know where it's going. So my focus is, what can we do to adapt? If we're designing a building that's going to last 50 years or 100 years, are we designing for today's climate, or are we designing for where the climate is changing to? And how can we affect and better prepare for that? So that's where we're going now. It's happening. We just need to learn how to adapt.
So one of our board members, Ben Abbott, has done research or published research about the impacts of pollution on health. And David, you can relate to this. In his summary of other people's research, they've concluded that in Utah, people's health or lifespan is reduced, 1 to 3 years on average because of air pollution. That's something that impacts everybody, and we should all be concerned about.
Some have gone so far as to say that we would make a better investment to put our money into solving air pollution, in our valley at least, than directly into education, because air pollution has such a profound direct effect on young children's ability to benefit from education. And solving the air pollution problem leads to direct improvements in their ability, in their scores in school.
We have another comment from somebody listening said something about having a ward earth stewardship leader. Do you think wards, or do you think the church could encourage wards to have somebody tasked with addressing environmental issues and trying to reduce pollution and waste and at the ward level?
Apparently it's already happening. It doesn't happen, need to get permission from the church level, I understand. Maybe just the bishop and a stake president that can make that happen. It is happening.
So we can
It
all,
Oh, sorry, what?
so we can all push that at our ward and stake level. Go ahead, Emily.
I think so. And I've been in a YSA ward for a long time, but I don't know what it's really like back in the family wards, but they're scrambling for callings for us because they want everybody to be involved. So they're making up weird callings. And so if somebody suggested something like that, I think they would be thrilled to have more people involved. So I think it's generally something we could all be asking about.
Yeah, I think that's an example of where we can push from the bottom up, and we really need to do that. I think we also need to try to encourage leaders at the top of the organization to disseminate down to the whole church. And I would like to hear general conference talks that talk about the beauty of creation and the importance of being good stewards and addressing climate change and caring for our neighbors who are impacted by climate change, especially the poor and the marginalized.
I can tell you, I've been around long enough to have experienced that. Back in the 60s and 70s when oil was scarce, we were told to conserve, to not drive, and so forth. And talking about the environment was not uncommon in the Ensign and in the New Era and so forth. We have articles from that time, and we've had an abundance of statements by church leaders, maybe not so much as we'd like to see of late, but it's very much a part of our theology, part of our history, part of who we are.
I think a lot of wards and stakes, I'm sure the church have a lot of, do a lot of community service in beautifying communities as well. And we have at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, service projects. And locally in our community, that's been extended to not just our church, but it's actually become a community event. And so we've, one of the past mayors was in our stake, and he brought it up, and it's really caught on. So our whole community has an annual day of service, and which just gets everyone involved. So it's been wonderful.
I think the idea of church members being leaders on addressing climate change and environmental problems is something that I yearn for. I really hope we can do that. And I think, as Emily mentioned, we need to be anxiously engaged in a good cause. And as we do that, I think, as Dan, you're saying, community members will want to join with us in trying to make our communities better and our world better. So that's our challenge.
One of the events that happened in our valley not too long ago was a ward had to decide between enlarging their parking lot or planting more green space and gardens. And that was a real debate apparently, and the gardens won. But that's when you know they're serious. And we can all walk to church from the wards in the valley I'm in. And yet how many drive multiple cars a couple of blocks? And you know, other changes like that wouldn't be hard to make if we are incentivized and think about it and so forth.
Well, this has been a wonderful discussion. We appreciate so much, David, Dan, and Emily, your inspiring comments, and I think our participants who've been listening have been inspired and motivated to do more. I hope we can all go be more anxiously engaged in the cause of addressing climate change and trying to promote things like the Paris Climate Accord that can benefit all of us, and especially the poor among us who are most affected by the impacts of climate change. So I'll let you know that this meeting has been recorded, and we will be making it available on our website, so you can share it with others in the future at mesastewardship.org. We also have other information about our work. We encourage you to follow us on social media, Facebook and Instagram if you're so inclined, and you can join in our efforts. There's other great organizations working to address climate change like Citizens Climate Lobby and LDS Earth Stewardship. There's lots of environmental groups that are not associated with our faith that are working hard to address environmental and pollution problems. So this is an exciting time to be on the earth. We have a lot of work to do, but we're strong if we work together, and so I think that's our mandate. Thank you all again for participating.